News of today, Hanif Atmar is back in business. Have you heard about that?
I have, yeah. I mean, the thing with Hanif Atmar is that he never seems to be out of business for very long. So, from what I mean, it's surprising, but at the same time, it's Hanif Atmar, so it's not surprising,
Yeah,
So,
because he split from Ashraf Ghani before the elections, and then he posed with his bodyguards. That the James Bond, the mafia, the Cosa Nostra picture with all those guys with machine guns. Do you remember?
I think I do, yeah.
Yeah. So
the thing with Afghan politicians is that so many of them try to give off the edgy macho look.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've transplanted Hanif Atmar's head on another politician's body, but it's the meaning is the same anyways.
Yeah. So he decided to split from Ashraf Ghani's government. He was his head of the Security Council, and then when he got basically when he left government, he announced that he's going to become a candidate for the presidency, right? So when that happened, there were a lot of skeptics, particularly non-Pashtuns, who were saying this is all a scam. Ashraf Ghani and Atmar are just both the same people from the same background. They have the same agenda. They just want to appear divided so that they weaken the opposition. Which actually
it makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean, if we look at it in hindsight, you could make sense of such a sort of estimate as to what the reality is, but yeah, potentially.
Because what happened is Hanif Atmar became a candidate for a presidential race in Afghanistan. A lot of people from the opposition, like the people who are opposed to Ghani, they joined Hanif Atmar's team.
Yeah.
But then during the elections, Hanif Atmar decided that he backtracked. but by that time, the opposition was already scattered. So it was a race between Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah. And Ashraf Ghani co-opted Amrullah Saleh. And that made him a formidable candidate, which eventually resulted to him winning 900,000 votes, something like that.
900,000 votes in a country of 30 plus million, eh?
Yes.
But I mean, obviously, I would understand that. I mean, I was personally skeptical when it happened as well, especially given that obviously the litmus test of politicians in Afghanistan is essentially security. And I think even Ashraf Ghani would agree that security hasn't been established in Afghanistan. And Hanif Atmar was his national security advisor. So it would be safe to assume that Atmar was at the very least influential in the security policy that was being carried out. And, the main talking point amongst political parties is not the rate of income tax and VAT, it's security. And if they're feeling adventurous, maybe corruption as well. So I mean, when Atmar splits from Ashraf Ghani, and I remember the criticism was quite mild. It was suspiciously mild, especially in a country as polarized as Afghanistan. I was skeptical, but I mean, I have no doubt that many sort of non-Pashtuns would look at that and be pessimistic or, suspicious of it. But at the same time, I think a large number of Pashtuns feel neither represented by Ashraf Ghani or Hanif Atmar, the same way that Hazaras don't really feel represented by Muhaqqiq, or Tajiks don't feel represented by Abdullah, when he's decided he is Tajik, because there's a huge question mark over his ethnicity. But I mean, yeah, in Afghanistan, ethnicity is a game that's played by politicians. Ashraf Ghani simultaneously appealed to sort of a core base of, let's say, nationalist Pashtuns in the country's south and east, whilst at the same time he's got Amrullah Saleh by his side.
Yes.
So it's just a case, I think, of finding the common denominator being everything to everyone. And I think, even Babrak Karmal did this with claiming to be a Ghilzai Pashtun when he was most likely of Kashmiri descent. So, it's the same cycle, different actors, different players, the same game. Never really gets old. I mean, for us, it's boring, but
But
apparently
sadly, a
they
lot
think
of
it
people
works.
fall for it, and that's what my concern is that let's assume that this particular theory about a scam, a trick played out by Ashraf Ghani and Atmar. Let's assume that this is true, which where I have no proof of it. I don't know if it's true,
I
but
don't think we'll ever find proof,
yeah,
but
but let's assume that it is the truth. This kind of political scheming further polarizes the society. It creates more division, and it sends off a message to a large portion of the society by saying, look, we're playing this game, we are scheming, you know it, we know it, deal with it.
I mean, I would agree with that. It definitely sort of polarizes society. It poisons the discourse. But I would add at the same time that whilst it polarizes society, the fact that, I mean, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but Afghanistan's population, we've had the lack of a census since about the late 1970s, but we're estimating, let's assume that it's somewhere between 30 and 35 million. Now, assuming it's between the total voter turnout was somewhere between 2 and 3 million, of which Ashraf Ghani gained apparently the plurality of the votes. So, I mean, that's quite a damning indictment of Ashraf Ghani as well as the other politicians from, your standard Afghan, most probably living in the rural parts of the country. But the games that we're talking about being played with ethnicity and, in the midst of a raging war, if Ashraf Ghani and Atmar are playing their game to sort of divide and then converge and whatever, it's the mainstream media, which is based in the cities, obviously affects perceptions across the country. So it really, feeds into quite a toxic environment, both within society at large and the mainstream media, even if most Afghans are indifferent to it, which I would argue they prove they are just by their non-attendance, their absence from voting. So, yeah, it's surprising, but it's Afghanistan, so it's not surprising. And it's the kind of stuff that makes Afghanistan, rightly or wrongly, entertaining to read about and to, examine at a more deeper level. So, what do you think? Do you think it was, are you more or less inclined to believing it was a plan all along?
I have honestly no idea, but
Yes.
I do think that this does negatively influence the minds of a lot of people. We already have a major deficit of trust in the government, and
Definitely.
these kinds of schemes they only further the distrust people already have. So, shall we begin?
I think we should.
Yeah.
The question isn't who should we begin, it's who should begin.
Okay, let's start. Okay, assalamu alaikum and welcome to the third episode of the AfghanEye podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about our motivation, our reasons for starting the AfghanEye, who we are, what motivates us, and what we are trying to achieve. So we'll start off by asking Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, please tell us about yourself, about your own background, and what is it there to know about you, so that when people are listening to us and when they um, hear our conversations, that they get a good idea what we represent and where we come from.
Sure. So, I mean, I would hope by now that everyone knows that my name is Ahmed-Waleed Kakar. So I'm 24 years of age, and I hope they also know that I'm the founder of AfghanEye. But just before we get started, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone that's subscribed to our YouTube channel since our podcast episode with Fazl Minallah Qazi, where we discussed his book and Gulbuddin Hikmatiyar. Thank you to everyone that shared it, and I'm very much glad that so many people enjoyed it and found it as enlightening as I did. Now, with regard to my background, do you sort of mean my educational or sort of more family background?
Yes, like you are obviously from an Afghan origin, Afghan background, and
Thank you for clarifying.
yeah, and the thing is that we're talking about the AfghanEye, so the Afghan perspective on
Sure.
current affairs and politics and history. So therefore, it's maybe it's necessary to tell
Yeah.
our audience more about your own background and
Sure.
what makes your perspective an Afghan perspective.
Oh, I mean, that's
Yeah.
an interesting one. So, I mean, I'm a historian by trade. So, I did politics and history at undergraduate, and I did a master's in world history. Um, in my master's, my dissertation focused on Afghanistan in the 19th century, and Afghanistan in the 19th century is a period that I feel isn't very understood either by Afghans or by neighboring people from neighboring countries. So I would say that with being grounded in a sort of a historical perspective, as well as sort of having visited Afghanistan quite a number of times and keeping in contact with family there, the my understanding of sort of culture and heritage of the region would make my perspective Afghan, if you will. And more importantly than all of that is the fact that we're not, at AfghanEye, we're not sort of aiming to push forward a narrative that stems from an ideological standpoint. So, yeah, I mean, that's my essentially my personal background.
Can you tell us maybe something about your origin from Afghanistan?
Okay, sure. So my father is from Kabul province. He was born and raised in Kabul city. His ancestral village is in Karabakh district or Walaswali. Um, you know, and he was born and raised in Kabul. My mother is from the south of Afghanistan, from Kandahar. My paternal ancestors migrated to Karabakh district when Timur Shah Durrani, the son of Ahmad Shah, transferred the capital to Kabul because they were sort of influential or members of the military of the time. So yeah, my father, in terms of political activities, it was in his late teens when the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan launched, or one faction of it launched a coup d'état against the government of President Dawood. And yeah, after that he joined. It was quite funny how he joined the Hizb Islami sort of militarily, but he was active in the Mujahideen and he joined Hizb Islami Gulbuddin, where he operated in and around Kabul province.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and how did your father eventually leave Afghanistan? How did that happen?
Okay, so I mean, my father was in his late teens when the communist revolution happened, and so one of his close friends that lived not so far away from him was involved in sort of very much a wrestler, what we would say kushti or palawani. And he was actually, this is in the 1980 Olympics in Russia. This friend of my father's was actually shortlisted to go and be part of the team. Now, my father, as well as sort of the other Hizb Islami underground members in Kabul, sort of wrote letters, what we would call shabnama, right? A knight's letter that was stuck outside his house warning him not to go. And after that friend of my father sort of defected and sort of ran away and didn't join, my father was implicated to the secret police of the time as a close friend of the man who fled, the wrestler. And so as a result, my father had to leave Kabul. And that was in 1980 that he left Kabul, and he was active in rural parts of the country until he left in 1982.
Okay, that's quite opposite of what I experienced.
Sure. So, what would you say you experienced? I mean,
Yeah,
I'm sure you have stories of your own.
I'm from totally opposite spectrum of Afghanistan's politics.
Sure.
Yeah, my father, he was a member of Hizb Democratic Khalq Afghanistan, and he was active in politics, and he worked for the government during the era of Karmal and Najib. And,
Okay.
yeah, I was born in Kabul.
Okay.
And I was I lived first part of my life in Kabul, and what was really interesting about my personal experience in Afghanistan is that as a child I saw a stark contrast in our society, even within my own family. Like while my father was working for the government, obviously progressive leftist government supported by Soviet Union during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. I had relatives in our village who were with Harakat and Hizb Islami.
Okay.
And one of my earliest memories as a child is that my grandfather, who used to be Malik in our village, he was a village elder, he would always pick me up from my home, and he would take me to his home, or he would take me to visit other relatives and people from our tribe and village. And he once took me to a wedding in Bibi Maro in Kabul. North of Kabul is a part of the city called Bibi Maro, and there was a wedding of our relatives. And in that wedding, it was in a qala, in a typical, mud building. And in that wedding, there were people from all sides of our family, from my paternal side of the family. So people who were there, who worked for the government, and they were wearing uniforms, and they come in their uniform to the wedding. And there were people who had long hair and beards and pakuls, and they were also wearing a uniform.
The opposite side. Yeah, the opposite sides. I'm not wearing a pakol right now, so I can't qualify. But yeah, sure.
So yeah, we had two opposing sides in that conflict present at that wedding. And a lot of people, relatives, they knew who I was. Like I was the son of so-and-so. So the guys, they would come and they asked me like, okay, Sangar, how are you doing? Yeah, fine. So, Sangar, are you with the Mujahideen or are you with the government? They were joking, and they were asking me this question. And I think I was 5, maybe 6. I was really young. And it's one of my earliest memories. So they asked me this question. And I said, obviously, I'm with Ashrar. And Ashrar is how...
Oh, my God. Yeah, of course. Yeah, Ashrar.
So I'm with Ashrar, and it's an anecdote, you remember things, like what you have experienced as a child. But later on in life, when you think about your earliest memories, you start to realize that the society, the way you live, like where I used to live in Kabul, we lived in the city. I attended the school. We used to have Russian teachers, and our government, the people who worked for the government, they were very active in and around our environment.
Yeah,
And
of course.
that was like sort of a bubble inside Kabul of people on the side of the government. But then there was another side of the society. There was another experience of life in Afghanistan during the
Yeah,
war. And as a child, I was too young to realize that what I was seeing and what I was experiencing was a sharp contrast between two different um
two
rounds
different
of reality.
Afghanistans.
Yes, but later on in life, I became more aware of this fact, and especially when I was living in UK for a short while, I got to know Afghans who grew up in refugee camps in Pakistan.
Okay.
They grew up as orphans because their parents, their fathers, were killed during the war in Afghanistan. There was one guy, his father, he was killed during the battle in Jalalabad. He was
The
fighting,
1989 battle.
yes, and his
Yeah.
father was fighting with the Mujahideen against the government, and he was killed during that battle. And there was another guy. His father was arrested and killed by the state security in Afghanistan. And these guys, they became my friends in UK. And for a short while, we used to live in the same apartment. So we became friends, and they knew who I was. They knew what my background was,
Background, yeah.
and the fact that my father worked for that government that is responsible for the fact that their fathers died. So despite having these two totally opposing backgrounds and experiences, we became friends. We shared the same apartment, and we would hang out every day with each other. And this experience made me realize that our life and our history, our experience is a lot more complex than what we would like to assume. And this is why I think this is what motivates me to be so involved and active in journalism and in storytelling. Why? Because I think that the narrative surrounding Afghanistan is dominated by certain views and perspectives.
Yeah.
And especially if you are from a very like for instance, for people from my background, from my particular background, people who were on the side of the government in the 80s, they have a worldview that I disagree with. And the reason why I disagree with is because of the exposure I had with the other side. And
Of course.
the reason why the role of independent media and media that isn't financed and supported by a particular agenda or interest group is necessary is because we have to have these dialogues and conversations where we learn about ourselves and become aware of our own biases. And maybe as a result of these conversations and as a result of these stories, we may be able to develop a counter narrative to the prevalent narrative of war and constant animosity and hostility. And I think that this is a responsibility we have as Afghans who are aware of these matters. So this is basically what motivates me, and this is also how I became involved with this project.
No, I can relate to that sort of. I mean, obviously not in the same sort of sense, but I mean, when you're growing up in the West, as I was, and you sort of see Afghanistan get invaded when I was about 6, and then Iraq was invaded. One of the questions that I always found was, why was Afghanistan the good war, right?
Yeah.
And why was Iraq the bad war? Why was it justified on one country but not justified on another, the invasion and occupation? And oftentimes, what I would sort of, I'm sure many others can sort of understand what I'm saying here, is that the anti-war narrative has subtle leftist undertones. One could even say overtones. And that sort of, the narrative that's put forth, which stems from an ideological standpoint, affects policymaking, right? It shapes society, it shapes society's perceptions, and ultimately affects policymaking. But, uh, as educated Afghans, right, who want to divorce the discourse in Afghanistan from ideology and present Afghanistan for what it is and not what it should be, right? I think it's very important that we challenge those sort of, those prevalent narratives. And the reality is that a lot of money and a lot of resources go into sort of pushing certain narratives. And whilst media, whether in Afghanistan or especially in the West, likes to talk to people that it knows or experts whose views are palatable and which sound nice, media may prefer to talk to these people. But the fact is that what we can say after 18 years of war in Afghanistan is that what they're saying isn't necessarily true, because if what they were saying were true, things wouldn't have ended up so disastrously as they have. And I don't think anyone can objectively say that Afghanistan right now, after nearly 19 years of occupation, war, conflict, is in some sort of ideal state, So as a result of that, sorry, I think there's a...
barking dogs.
Oh, it's life. But I think the coronavirus lockdown is probably getting to him. But yeah, so sorry, I lost. So yeah, I mean, what I was aiming to do and hoping to do with AfghanEye is to sort of provide, launch a platform where Afghans can interact with each other, share ideas, disagree with each other, even disagree vehemently with each other, without war on terror rhetoric or ideological standpoints, unnecessarily making the conversations toxic.
Yeah, speaking of war on terror rhetoric, see, what I experienced in the last 19 years is that the war on terror rhetoric is of two kinds.
Okay.
There is this one war on terror rhetoric in the West that is prevalent. It's the idea that, the West was attacked by radical Islam because they hate our freedoms. So we have to go and bomb them, to submit them, to understand that freedom and liberty is great and they should accept it. This is the one perspective that is often presented as the neocon narrative, but then there is this other narrative that is also quite prevalent, and you sort of hinted at that, and that's the liberal and leftist progressive idea of being anti-war, but at the same time using a lot of tropes, a lot of stereotypes about Muslims and about Muslim societies.
Diet Orientalism.
Diet Orientalism. Because see, what happens is that you have these. I'll paint a picture by referring to something I saw on a very popular leftist Facebook page. They were sharing pictures of Afghan women in miniskirts during the 70s.
Oh, no.
They were saying, before the CIA and before the Western countries try to sort of shape the Afghanistan politics, etc., Afghanistan was a very progressive and enlightened country, and women were wearing miniskirts. So their idea is that just because there are a few pictures of women in inner city Kabul who used to wear miniskirts, it means that the rest of the society was also very leftist and progressive, and
Yeah.
they believed in all these progressive leftist ideas. But somehow the CIA financed a few radical jihadis and
With
Wahhabis.
beards and turbans.
Yes, and then the whole society suddenly was forced to grow a beard and wear burqas and chadaris, etc.
And then the patriarchy came back.
Yes, and these are the two narratives that are clashing in Western media.
Exactly.
Then, when you see that, if you're pro-war, you're a neocon, and you believe that these savages need to be civilized, and we need to export democracy in Afghanistan, like the whole social engineering that occurred in the last 19 years. And the anti-war, the progressive, the leftist anti-war narrative is, well, there wasn't anything wrong about Najibullah's government. The Soviet Union, they were just trying to help, and it was
a charity project that went wrong.
Yes, yes. So these are the two prevalent narratives, and when you try to understand Afghanistan's history, its people, its culture, its challenges, economic, social, political challenges, you realize that the reality is much more complex. But sadly, when you hear Afghans in the Western media, or when you hear Afghans who are very active and involved in the media, in journalism, or as academics, they often fall in either two of these categories. If they're pro-war, they will just say the same things that we've been hearing on CNN and BBC for the last 19 years. And if they're anti-war, they talk like they're a commentator on Russia Today.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm really glad you touched on the women in skirts phenomenon, right? Because it's actually important. I believe one of Trump's national security advisors is a guy called, I forgot his first name, but it's McMaster.
Yes.
And when Trump first became president, obviously people were scared that, this guy is an isolationist. He's going to pull out of Afghanistan completely, and then the Taliban are going to come back, etc. And it was reported that one of the ways in which Trump was persuaded to at least stay a bit longer in Afghanistan was by McMaster showing him pictures of
women in miniskirts.
The infamous women in miniskirts in Kabul University in the 70s, right? To say, there is hope to be had. Like this used to be what it was. We can still do this. Now, obviously, with the nature of Trump's temperament, I don't think it was a long-lasting effect that it had, relatively, given, the peace deal that's been signed recently, and, then the U.S. Cutting aid to Kabul. But, I mean, it's indicative that an image like that was influential in changing Trump's mind even for one day is, something that's worth noting. And, and the thing is that we think that war on terror narrative is pushed by neocons, and then sometimes people will say neocons use this narrative to steal oil and natural resources from Muslim countries. But with that to one side, governments of Muslim majority countries are also very, very much leading the battle in the war on terror narrative. I mean, it's sort of the Afghan government will portray one position in English and another in Pashto and Farsi. whereby in speaking to an English-speaking audience, terms like really politically loaded terms like radical Islam, Islamist terrorism, fanatic, fanatics, all of
Yes.
the sound bites, they will use these freely without any qualms. Whereas in speaking in Pashto and Dari, they'll talk about Islam and the motherland and the religious duty that's incumbent on people to defend the motherland.
Yes.
So I mean, unfortunately, that sort of the ideological philandering, jumping, whatever works, it's had such a disastrous effect on actual policy making. And
Yes.
you mentioned Afghans. I'm just going to mention Afghans and media, Western media, Afghans with non-political interests who do not represent political entities or organizations are rarely, if ever, spoken to. So to the extent that people in Afghanistan, oftentimes, when they hear what their government representatives are saying abroad, cannot even relate to it,
Yes.
So that is just one way in which,
And
perceptions are weaponized.
and would you agree that if I say that Afghans who do have a more nuanced perspective, that they are very shy and reclusive, they don't really want to. Uh,
Yeah, I would. I mean, my personal experience would say that. I'd say throughout my time being politically conscious, I've always made the mistake of asking the wrong questions so I mean, I'm someone who would like to gain a comprehensive holistic perspective on a given issue, a given political development or issue. In doing that, you obviously offend people just by asking them questions. And if you're a practicing Muslim, let's say, and you ask the wrong questions, then immediately from certain quarters, there'll be an attempt to sort of silence you. You sound like this. Are you
yeah,
justifying this? Why don't you believe this? So
yeah,
I think I myself was susceptible and fell to that for a number of years, actually. But it got to the point where I sort of thought, there needs to be a platform out there
yes,
for Afghans, non-Afghans, non-Muslims even.
yes,
Afghanistan is interesting to many people, not just Muslims or Afghans, but for people to learn about the country for, as I said, what it is and not what it should be. Divorced from ideological goals that whichever side wants to accomplish.
yeah. What I also I would add to that is that um, when you talk about Afghanistan, especially in the last 19 years, there are certain perspectives that you can only hear about if you speak Pashto and Dari, if you speak to people from rural areas in Afghanistan,
Yeah,
if you know about their worldview and perspective, which you never see in the mainstream media. Like
yeah,
if you see Afghanistan, what is the most prevalent perspective of Afghanistan? In the beginning, there were mini skirts in Kabul. Then the Mujahideen came because the Soviet Union and there was a war, and then that was replaced by the Taliban.
bearded bad boys.
Yeah, and the Taliban after the Taliban, then we had to bomb them into civilization. And since then, we have democracy. And now there is a skate park in Kabul where girls can skate, and we have an orchestra of girls playing violins and whatnot. And that's how Afghanistan is simplified and made like something that is entirely alien to how people experience Afghanistan in rural Afghanistan. And mind you, majority of people in Afghanistan are from rural parts. The
Yeah,
the, the,
yeah,
the
yeah,
people in the cities, although due to the war there is a massive influx of people into the cities, but vast majority of the people are from the rural parts of Afghanistan,
yeah.
and their views, their opinions, their values, and their perspectives matter.
Yeah,
But
and
you don't hear that, and what you get as a result is that decisions that affect all of them, in particularly the people in the rural areas, the poor people, are based on a very distorted idea of what Afghanistan is, who Afghans are, and what they should do or what should happen to them.
yeah, I mean, especially, I'm glad you mentioned sort of the influx into urban centers of rural communities. But I mean, even that's only been ongoing for the last 10, 20 years. So much of those newly urban residents sort of are very much still grounded in a rural perspective because they still have family in their villages. They still visit their villages. They maintain connections with their villages. So even the, urban versus rural dichotomy, which does exist, even the urban category, if you will, is diluted by a lot of disillusionment with how things are done. And I don't think that the narrative put forth of, like you said, jolly good couple, Soviet invasion, awful bearded guys, and
Yeah.
yay, now we've got US invasion, and now we're going to get rainbows. That's not restricted to the politics or the media either. It's the popular media, it's culture.
Yes.
The same kinds of ideas were put forth in very popular works of literature, like Khalid Hosseini's books.
Yes.
I cannot tell you how many times someone has sort of asked me, like, "Oh, what is your ethnic background?" When I say Afghanistan, a lot of the times people say, "Ah, it's such a beautiful country. I read The Kite Runner." Uh, it's so sad what happens, but I'm
Yeah.
glad things are getting better.
Yeah.
I hope things get better now. I read The Kite Runner, such a beautiful book, and to give him credit, Khalid Hosseini is a very talented and gifted writer, but that popular perception is not just the security apparatus here, public perceptions here. No, a lot of Afghans even have read
They've
those books.
internalized. They've
A lot of
internalized a lot of ideas.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly. A lot of Afghans living in the West have read those books and have had their perceptions of, let's say, their country of
Yes.
origin have been colored very heavily by those books. And I mean, I would say that the best form of information or misinformation is for people to not know that you're doing it. If
Yes.
people are unsuspecting, they'll be more susceptible to listen or read a certain narrative. So yeah, I mean those are just, I think he's got 2 or 3 books. But yes, I mean the demonization of rural people, demonization of people with beards, um, you know.
And one of the most interesting thing is that, like for instance, in my situation, I live in the Netherlands, and a vast majority of Afghans in the Netherlands are people who have fled Afghanistan in the 90s, so
Okay.
after the fall of the communist regime. So these people, they are either part of the leftist elite from Kabul, um, or there are people who are children of those people
Yeah.
from the leftist elite in Kabul. So they have a very distorted image of their own history and background. So what happens is, like, I've had this so many times. In Holland, they're very tolerant, despite what you hear in the
Okay.
news about Geert Wilders and PVV. The Netherlands is a very tolerant country. And as a Muslim, we do have some restrictions, and there are a lot of problems that we face as Muslims in this country. I've talked about it many times. Despite all of those challenges, it's still a very, very, very tolerant country. So, as a Muslim, if I decide I can go and dressed in my traditional Afghan clothes, I can go outside I even used to go to work like that. There was not a problem. In certain professions, you can dress the way you like. Nobody's going to bother you. And the only problem I faced is with other Afghans who would object against the fact that I have a beard. They would object against the fact that I wear Afghan clothes. Like, why are you doing? Why are you dressed like this? Why are you as an Afghan? Why do you have a beard? And
of course,
this discomfort and this sort of animosity and hatred towards people who have a certain lifestyle or belief that is very common in Afghanistan.
the most common.
Yes, and it's quite confusing. Like, on the one hand, these people, they drive around in a car, and their back mirror in the middle, they have this small flag of Afghanistan hanging there.
Yeah.
And they're very proud of the fact that they're from Afghanistan, and they boast about Afghanistan and their history. We have 5,000 years of history in Afghanistan, and all these slogans. But then, if you talk to them, like, what's your objection against the fact that I dress like this? Isn't this the clothes of the people in Afghanistan? Well, yes. And isn't it true that a lot of Afghans have a beard? Yes, but this country that I think
they'll say that the reason the country is in the state it is because the men dress a certain way, and because the men prefer to grow beards, and that's why they're backwards and unenlightened. But I find one thing very, very sort of funny, if you will. Like, it's sad, but it's funny. Is that, like I said, I'm a historian by trade, right? The whole claim of we have 5,000 years of history, but no, I mean, assuming that was true, right? Why does your historical awareness only restrict itself to posh families in Kabul after, let's say, the 40s or 50s, when people started to shave their beards and dress more in I mean, because this phenomenon only started happening in, let's say, halfway through Zahir Shah's time, when there was a program for modernization, and Western fashion became more accessible, and people started to obviously imitate it more. This as a phenomenon, if we were to take the 5,000-year benchmark, it accounts for what, 1% of that, so 50, 60 years ago. So I mean,
this is exactly the problem. If we can, obviously, I'm very critical of the way Western portrayal of Afghanistan. I'm critical of the fact that Western media and politicians deliberately choose to portray Afghanistan in a certain way. But at the same time, we as a society, we have to acknowledge the fact that a lot of our elite have internalized certain worldviews and perspectives that are detrimental to our
well-being as a society.
And in Afghanistan, you have this expression Roshan Fikr. Like we always have to say, well, he's a Roshan Fikr. He's enlightened.
How would we translate Roshan? Enlightened.
So he's enlightened. So enlightened means basically someone who is secularly educated. But if we look at our media, look at our literature, modern literature, our most influential politicians, thought leaders who are considered Roshan Fikr, these people, they are also involved in the conflict in the last 40 years. Like the educated elite were part of the Hizb Democratic Khalq. They were responsible for the start of the war. And even today, if you look at Afghan politics, there are educated elite with doctoral degrees and so many.
Our president, one of our presidents.
And they are involved in what? Using ethnicity language, and regionalism in politics, which further destabilizes the country. So we as a society, as people who are concerned about our future, our people, we have to be able to look at our own elites from a very critical perspective. Like, okay, so you are Roshan Fikr, so you are enlightened, so you have all these degrees and whatnot, but why is it that you fall for the same uh, things that are actually contributing to more polarization, more instability in our society? Uh, these things need to be discussed, and there needs to be a place, a platform where we can have these conversations. Obviously, even with those Afghans who may have
Of course.
opposing views, but these conversations need to be constructive. Like
Sure.
what you often see, or like in Facebook, if you watch Facebook,
Facebook.
Pashto, yeah, Pashto and Dari Facebook pages, it's constantly a barrage of insults, and
Yeah.
the conversations are quite depressing, because you see people constantly referring back to, okay, he's a Pashtun, he's a Tajik, he's a Hazara, and then within Pashtuns, yeah, he's Ghaljai, he's Durane, this and that, and these things seem very shallow and superficial, and sometimes very silly and stupid, but then you see that they play out in a bigger scheme of things, in politics, in elections, and in the media. Like, we have all these different TV channels in Afghanistan. We have Tolo, which is financed by USAID and partially owned by Rupert Murdoch. Then we have Juandun, the TV station of Ismail Yoon, which is basically a Pashtun nationalist platform. We have Hazaras, they have their own websites and they have their own TV stations. Dostum has his own TV station, and all this media, and there are even universities in Kabul. One university is created by one faction, the other is created by other faction, and you would say that all this development, all this creation of new media and university, they may contribute to a
society progressing.
Yes, to a stage where we no longer put each other down, or oppose each other based on our ethnicity or background. But no, you see that they're contributing to more hostilities and more tensions. And if we can't have a critical perspective on all of these developments, we will be actually either sitting on the sideline and just observing, or we're actually involved in what is detrimental to our society.
Yeah, no, I mean, you mentioned the educated, the enlightened, the Roshan Fikrs, right? So, I mean, what I would say is that, according to this narrative, the reason Afghanistan is economically underdeveloped, disadvantaged, the country is in war, is these people would say because of Besiwadi, because of illiteracy and people being uneducated. Now, and then they would say, look, like if the country had an educated leader like Dr. Najibullah Ahmedzai, or Ashraf Ghani, or any of the other guys, Dr. Abdullah, the country would progress, we would get rid of illiteracy, and we would be on the path to a more prosperous future. Now, what I would counter this point with is no one, in my view, has done more damage to Afghanistan than the Roshan Fikr, the educated. Now, when the communist coup d'etat happened in 1978, in Afghanistan, one of our historically we can analyze one of the Achilles heel of the state is its traditional weakness, right? The state in Afghanistan has always been traditionally weak. By 1978, when the coup happened, there had been about 49 years of uninterrupted peace, right?
Yes.
From Nadir Shah taking the throne from Kalakani all the way until Dawood Khan getting killed. The Afghan state had 5 decades where it consolidated. The government apparatus was there. Now, the Roshan Fikrs, the educated that took power after that, unleashed 50 years of state centralization and accumulation of power and resources on the rural population in a war that killed 2 million people in collaboration with the Soviets, right?
Yes.
So I'm willing to critique those who are uneducated and whatever, but then why, at least one could say they have an excuse of not being educated,
Yes.
right? What was the excuse of those who are educated, who
Yes.
knew how detrimental this was to society? And I wouldn't only limit this to seculars, leftists, or progressives in Afghanistan, who've obviously demonstrated quite a propensity towards using violence. I would also use it for those on the religious side of the spectrum, who wanted to achieve certain ideological goals in the Mujahideen. We noticed that the parties, the parties of people like Yunus Khalis, you mentioned Harakat Inqilab Islami, the non-Ikhwani parties, if you will, the traditionalist parties, were not very much involved in the civil war, because as
After the departure of the Soviet Union.
after sorry, I didn't make that clear. After the collapse of Najib's government, there was obviously an intra-Mujahideen civil war in which the
Yes.
ex-communists had infiltrated. The non-Ikhwani parties, sort of the more traditionalist parties, if you will, were not involved. And as we sort of discussed in the previous podcast with Qazi Zayseb, there was quite an ideological underpinning in that conflict that took place that took 4 years. So,
Yes.
the narratives and the goals and the stated aims and ambitions always come down to an ideological route which seeks to achieve something, and it can only achieve it apparently through violence,
Yes.
through mass violence.
And I think that what the common denominator between the progressives, the leftists, secularists, if you will, and Islamists or Ikhwanis or whatever, is that they have a political ideology. They have a utopian view of what society should be.
Yeah.
And in order to achieve that, they are willing to use violence. They're willing to rely on Western or Eastern, whatever, aid, sponsorship, in order to shape the society. And if there is any opposition, well, then bad luck. They will just chop heads.
Good or bad luck to them.
Yes, and this is sadly we can both agree on that this is sadly the reality of Afghanistan. And when we look back at our recent history in the last 40 years, a lot of us are affected by these two opposing views. Like if you are from a very secular and leftist and progressive background, obviously you think, well, Afghanistan needed that development and revolution and progress.
I think some people still argued, like I've read people still saying that, for example, this massacre, this war, it was worth it. It was needed.
The Herat massacre. A few days ago, it was the 40 years, 41 years since the Herat massacre. And there were people on Facebook saying, well, basically it was necessary. These people were opposing women's education, so 40,000 people massacred in the same day. That was necessary.
I know it's a lot of these ideologically rooted political positions have absolutely no qualms about inflicting mass violence on thousands of people in the country.
Yes.
And that is why I would argue we've had a war going on for 18 years. And the President Karzai himself didn't want to annihilate the Taliban. He sort of tried to make overtures, but actually was not allowed to do so by George Bush, right? But he had, I mean, to his credit, whilst I have my reservations about him, he had the common sense to know that, for example, the Taliban themselves, as a, not just as a group, but as a, you know, as a subculture in the deep south of the country in particular, are a product of political social evolution of the last few centuries. It's much, you know, deeper rooted than 1994. The ISI set up the Taliban and Mullah Omar. You know, I mean, he had the common sense to, but you know, he wasn't. He was constrained by George Bush in doing that, and we are where we are.
Yeah, and what's necessary now at this particular stage in our history is that while there is some sort of an agreement between United States and the Taliban, there are still a lot of perspectives about the war, about what needs to happen in Afghanistan. Among Afghans, what I am following right now is all these discussions between people on the side of the government and the Taliban. I think that it's necessary for us to carve our own space in the public arena where we can have these discussions and with people who are also open to a dialogue. Like we can expect the Taliban and the government to have a dialogue and reach some sort of agreement, but at the same time, there are people outside the realm of politics like us who are individuals concerned about the future of Afghanistan, and we need to carve a space where we can have these dialogues, especially here in the West. Why? Because what I notice is that more often you see Afghans who live here in the West, who have a home here, who have a Western, you know, Dutch, British, or American passport. When they become involved in politics or in any sort of activism, they are forced or they choose to pick up a side in that conflict in Afghanistan, and they become partisans. So even if they comment about current affairs, if they discuss anything, they choose to be very firmly grounded in one particular perspective, which is
it makes them unprincipled as well.
Yes, and that's why if we want this platform and this initiative to become successful, we need to be very clear about this, that we don't have the agenda of representing one specific faction in this conflict. We don't represent any particular leader. You won't see a picture of Masood Najib or any
Mullah
other Mullah Omar in our page. Like, he was a great leader and he was a hero, he was a shaheed. You know, we should avoid all of that, and we should accept the fact that we are a very diverse society. Afghanistan is very diverse. We have people with different ethnicities, languages, cultures, even different religions. And this is our reality. We are a very diverse society. And the only thing that unites us is our history. We have a shared history. Among the Muslims, we have a shared religion. And based on our shared experiences and certain shared values, we need to learn how to tolerate one another and have a constructive discussion about our current affairs. And if we are able to at least bring a few people together in this platform, if we are able to have conversations where we are not afraid of being critical of certain perspectives, I think we can, at the end of the day, say that we have contributed a little bit, something, a very small contribution.
I mean, in that limited contribution, like you said, like that in itself is not, in essence, limited, because you mentioned Talor, Rupert Murdoch, US aid. We don't have those resources and those connections, with people and organizations who will splash money on us to achieve whichever stated aim, But the like you said, we're just looking to get Afghans together, without the discourse being dictated by foreign projections of Afghanistan, whether they are terrorism deterministic, ethnically deterministic in any which way, because, like you said, the reality is much, much more complex. There are so many factors that we need to account for. And if we can, even in a limited space, add to sort of a more civil discourse and discussion about our heritage, our history, reconcile, let's say, old wounds or, whatever, and map a way forward in which we don't have to rely on foreign sponsors to keep fighting one another, because
and I want to also remind the people who are listening, I'm not saying that I'm not biased, that I'm above anything, like
we're human.
Yeah, like I am obviously very critical about a lot of things, and I will not shy away of being critical and bold in whatever I say. But at the same time, I believe that it is necessary to acknowledge that we have our own biases and we have our own perspectives and worldviews. And those perspectives and worldviews shape our thoughts and how we perceive things, and also how we may even influence others. But as people who are truly concerned and who are not politically active, we don't have a vested interest in defending our own perspectives. Like I'm not here to get votes or whatever. So I would appreciate subscriptions. Please subscribe.
I would also add that I would appreciate that deeply as well.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that the thing is that you need to expose yourself to criticism, especially your thoughts, your ideas, your beliefs. You need to expose it to criticism from people you trust. And the only way you can create a space where people trust each other is when you enter a dialogue on an equal footing. So when I talk to you, when I discuss politics and history and whatnot with you, I'm not here representing a political entity, and so I'm aware that you're not doing that as well. So we have to have mutual respect and understanding, and we have to also trust one another. So when you criticize my view and my perspective, it needs to come from a place, from a good place. Like I should be able to trust you, that whatever you say is not meant to put me down or shut me down,
silence
me, but the purpose of these dialogues need to be a way for us to understand each other, and maybe even trigger us to think critically about what we believe, and maybe encourage critical thinking amongst each other, amongst our peers. Because in a country at war for more than 40 years, I think we had enough of these political sloganeering and waving of banners and saying things that only sound good if you are campaigning, but in reality they don't really benefit people, and they don't really shape our society in a positive way. And there needs to be an initial step towards a more respectful and more tolerant discussion about politics and our current affairs.
I mean, yeah, 100%. And, especially in a lot of times you'll hear, once again, Afghans and non-Afghans will have this view that, you know, uh, our major weakness as a country and as a society is the fact that we are so heterogeneous, that we're so diverse. And if there was one language, and if there was one ethnic group, I'm going to do it this way, one language or one ethnic group that was predominant, and, there was a strict hierarchy, that, then everything would be okay. But I mean, I would say that there's no evidence to prove that, because, there are countries like Canada, for example, that have two languages, oftentimes very tense relationships that are not war-torn. I'm not saying that, even in the Netherlands, even in Belgium, in the UK, this sort of ethnically deterministic lens through which, if there's one winner, the winner takes all, then everything will be okay. It doesn't really work,
No.
So
I agree. And I think that we've sort of covered most important pressing issues that needed to be discussed about our project and our
background, our project,
yeah, and why we're doing this. I think that we've had hundreds of viewers and listeners of the previous two episodes who may have been interested in knowing what was is the end goal of this project. What are these guys doing? So
I
I
mean,
think this open and clear conversation may have cleared the airwaves for our audience.
Definitely.
That's what I intended.
No, I mean, I think I hope that because I mean, in the first two episodes, obviously we had two quite accomplished, high-profile guests, and we sort of were hoping to speak to them to gain their perspectives, from their backgrounds and whatever. But I mean, also, I think it's important for us to sort of speak about our own aims and our own goals with AfghanEye. And, I think I can't reiterate this enough. In discourse and in the literature of Afghanistan that's so dominated by political or even financial interests, vested interests, I cannot emphasize enough that we are completely independently run, and just as we in the first episode had Imran Feroz as a guest on our podcast, and in the second episode we had Fazl Minallah Qazizeh on our podcast, we want to speak to more such people, educated Afghans, maybe even non-Afghans, to gain their insights and their opinions. But to do that, obviously, is not free. And whilst we are lucky right now that we have the time due to coronavirus, due to COVID-19, everyone is locked in their homes, including us. We, in our day-to-day lives, we have many other responsibilities and duties that we need to fulfill. And in order to keep doing this, to keep providing, material and a platform for Afghans to engage with one another, we need continued support. We're not supported by Rupert Murdoch. I think that's a good thing, right?
Yes.
I'm happy that we're not supported by Rupert Murdoch, but the support of our viewers, our readers, our listeners is, in the long term, what will keep us going, because neither do I want this, and neither do you want this to be a project that, consistent output and then, fall flat on its face. No, we want to keep going, and we want to speak things into it. We want to speak our truth, the Afghan truth, into existence in the Anglosphere. We want it to influence the discourse in Afghanistan, and the primary aim of that is to further the cause of peace and to cease bloodshed. And I don't think anyone can object to that conscientiously. No, I mean, that's all I have to say. I hope not. Yeah, I hope too.
Okay. Dear listeners and viewers, thank you very much for again listening to our conversation. If you have already subscribed to our channel, thank you. And if you haven't, please do subscribe. As we have said before, these podcasts will eventually appear on all podcasting platforms. We've just started, so we will venture into different platforms. So stay in touch, follow our activities on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And the links to our platforms, you will find them in the description box of this video on YouTube. And obviously, if you visit our website, stay in touch. If you have any feedback, we are very delighted to hear about your views and suggestions. So do contact us. Again, on behalf of Ahmed-Waleed and myself, thank you very much, and wassalam.